Hello, welcome to Storytime. My name's Josh. Thank you for being here. If it's your first time, welcome to Storytime. If you're welcomed back, if I'm welcoming you back, if I knew how to speak right. We're going to be reading Mr. Forgetful today. Another Mr. Men Library Collection story by Roger Hargreaves. Hope you're comfortable. If not, get comfortable. Get ready, because we're about to delve into what? Story time. That's it. Yes. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep. Mr. Forgetful. Isn't that funny? He lives in Forget-Me-Not Cottage. His name's Mr. Forgetful. He was having a dream. Then the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. Oh, he yawned and stretched his arms and tried to remember what he'd been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't, because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. There he is. Poor Mr. Forgetful. That isn't very good at all. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face, but he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. And do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. Then he went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread, but of course he forgot about it and it was burnt. He boiled himself an egg, but of course he forgot about it and it was hard-boiled. Mr. Forgetful has burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. Poor guy. It was such a lovely day, Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down to the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago, but had forgotten to post. Off he set, and did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind him? Of course he didn't. There he is, at least he's got a big smile on his dial, his little hat on his head, and he's off on an adventure. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, says Mrs. Parcel in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? I'd like I've forgotten, he said. A stamp, suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter. Mr. Forgetful was obviously carrying that letter. Yes, a stamp. That's what it was I was trying to remember not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do. But could he remember what it was he was supposed to remember not to forget to shop for? It's a tongue twister. Of course he couldn't. So he decided to go home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. It's a bit sad. On his way, he met the village policeman going the other way. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said the policeman. Will you give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please? Probably not a good idea to tell Mr. Forgetful a message. Farmer Fields had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. There's the happy policeman there, out and about, doing his duty. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd never had a message to remember in his life before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself, trying to remember the message as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. 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 Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over to himself. There's a sheep loose in the lane. He's running down the path there, a little birdie flying next to him. You got it, Mr. Hargreaves. Sorry, not Mr. Hargreaves, Mr. Forgetful. Hargreaves is the title of the book. Eventually he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. Mr. Fields, he said, there's a goose asleep in the rain. Farmer Fields couldn't believe his ears. It sounds a little bit like there's a sheep loose in the lane, but it's there's a goose asleep in the rain. Ah, poor Mr. Forgetful. There's a goose asleep in the rain? Repeated Farmer Fields slowly. But I don't have any geese. And anyway, it isn't raining. Are you sure that was the message? Poor Mr. Forgetful. He got it all wrong, and he couldn't remember how to get it all right. He simply couldn't remember it all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Ah. It was all sad. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Field's farm, feeling very sorry for himself. I wish I could remember things, he thought. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into it and fell over. Bother, said Mr. Forgetful. Bah, said the sheep. How silly letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. Little does he know that's what he needs to remember. And then he remembered the message. He jumped up and ran back along the lane to the farm as fast as he could. Look at him go, he's running so fast his hat is off his head. Mr. Fields, Mr. Fields, he called as he ran into the farmyard. Mr. Fields, there's a goose asleep in the rain. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Fields scratched his head. Come with me, come on, cried Mr. Forgetful, and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. There it is, cried Mr. Forgetful, pointing. A goose! And then he stopped. Oh dear, he said. That's not a goose, is it? That's a sheep. And he blushed. Rosy red cheeks. I think, smiled Farmer Fields, that you're the goose. And he chuckled, and Mr. Forgetful giggled, and Farmer Fields laughed, and even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day it had been. But do you know something? He tried and tried, but try as he would, he simply couldn't remember anything that had happened. Oh, Mr. Forgetful. Well, there you go. Thank you so much for reading the story with me today. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back again with another story really soon. If you like these, please subscribe, click the bell below, and anything else. Have fun, be happy, be awesome, because you are, and chat really soon. Bye!